Welcome to this episode of A Conversation With. We've got Luke and myself here today speaking with Jilly Davis, who's going to have a bit of a conversation with us around PDA. You all right, Jilly?
I'm good, thank you, yes.
Good. I'm really glad that you've taken the time to speak to us today. Me and Luke were speaking yesterday about how excited we were just to pick your brains a little bit about PDA and to learn more than anything. Before we dive into the kind of nitty gritty about, PDA itself, I think it'd be really interesting for us just to find out a little bit more about you. So, what your journey has been through to where you are now, working with PDA, but in general, in education, I know, because obviously we've spoken, there's an element of that in there, but I know there's other things as well. So just, if you could give us a bit of an idea of what your journey is, that'd be lovely.
Okay, yeah, sure. It was way back in the 70s, I suppose. I actually did a social work course, but back in that time you could do different modules. So the first module was sort of basic general social work. Then you could specialize, and I specialized in child development. And then you could specialize again, and I specialized in special educational needs. So finished that. Fortunately got a job working for the National Autistic Society in a school down south. And then that was way back in 1978. And when I moved to Yorkshire in 1989, I joined another National Autistic Society school in South Yorkshire. And whilst working for that school, I qualified as a licensed teacher for the National Autistic Society. So that's sort of how I came into teaching, I suppose. A slightly different route to a lot of people. It was within that school back in about 2004 where we were seeing quite a different group of children coming through our admission process. So children who were coming from a mainstream background, children who were being excluded from a range of provision. And this was quite unusual for us to have that group because we were obviously a very specialist provision. Within that group, there were 2 or 3 children who we were struggling to engage in learning. They were having a huge impact on the learning of others and challenging our very autism-specific service. So I was given that role, really, of developing and managing a learning environment for these young people that were coming through our admission process. One of those kids, back in 2004, Andy was a Barnsley child, had a PDA diagnosis, which was really quite uncommon at that time. And the others didn't seem to fit the sort of our perception of autism at that time. So I was made assistant head and given the responsibility of developing a resource within our specialist resource to cater particularly for the needs of young people with either complex autism or that autism profile pathological demand avoidance, which we're sort of talking about today. So I've been working for about 20 years specifically with that group of children. Why I enjoyed that aspect was really about finding ways in to help them learn, to try and break down some of those barriers that they've been facing, to try and build up that trust in education, because all of them had a very, very disrupted education. And in fairness, to be honest, it was the children who taught me, because at that time there was very little out there. I did retire from school 3 years ago. Within that period, I was the PDA lead for the National Autistic Society. So I would attend conferences, deliver sessions on PDA, met a few people from the PDA Society, contacted them when I retired and said, look, can I help? Can I do anything? And immediately, this is a very small charity, and immediately they welcomed me in. And initially I was a volunteer, then I became a trustee, and now I'm the education advisor for the PDA Society. So that's sort of pretty much more or less where I got to. I suppose it's also, I think, important for me to mention, and chatting today, I'm coming from a professional perspective. I don't have PDA. What I can say is that, I've really tried to listen and learn from the PDA community, and everything we talk about today is at the heart of it are the PDA group, really, that we learn from.
Yeah. There's a couple of bits, again, before we sort of dive into the actual sort of topic or theme that from what you've said in your journey, I'd love to ask you about. So just for anybody that doesn't understand necessarily what the National Autistic Society setup is like, what you mentioned, sort of, you had a specialist class that suddenly became a little bit even more specialist. Could you just give us a bit of an insight as to what it was like being in one of those settings and what made it specialist?
Yeah, for sure. It was a very bespoke program. So we had a very big footfall, big school, and a lot of our young people, the whole school, were youngsters who'd probably had some disrupted education. So we were used to small classes, maybe 6 or 7. All those classes would have say perhaps tutorial rooms for the kids to go to if things were tough for them, etc. We had sensory rooms, we had sports centre, we had lots of things that were going off. But that still didn't work for our PDA learners. So we created their own learning spaces. So our fabulous maintenance team converted sort of several classrooms so that they were individual rooms. So the young people could come and look at us, see what we had to offer in terms of that safety space. But then it was working with them as to what they wanted from learning, why they wanted to come to us, what they wanted to get out from coming to us. And we tried to then create, based on their strengths, on their aspirations, what they wanted from education, and started at that point rather than coming in with, this is what we do, this is what, trying to fit them into the box that they weren't going to fit into, really. And that was about building up that trust. So each young person has their own learning space, but can access any part of school that they feel able to, whether it's another science lesson, whether it's the football club, whether it's going down to the dining room to eat lunch with others, however they feel that they can manage. And then gradually reintroduce either academic subjects if they wanted to, or socialize if they needed to socialize, or be with their peers, however that sort of worked. So a very bespoke, very personalized curriculum and that learning space. But it was all about inclusion at the pace that each child could manage, not about seclusion. We weren't shutting them off and saying, this is your space, this is about how can you handle this, how much can you handle. So we were really, when you were sort of selling it to them, I felt like I was a hotelier, really, saying, this is the room, this is what you've got, what colour walls do you want, what would you like to, what sensory items do you want to bring in that we could negotiate with. So it was we didn't follow the school organisation either. We had that flexibility. So I had to create sort of, policies and timetables around that, because the demand to come in at a certain time, the demand to go down to the dining room for lunch between 12 and 1 o'clock would be enough of a problem for them not to bother to eat, or they would struggle to come to school because the time is such a demand. So there was flexibility, there was collaboration all the way through, really.
So you're making reasonable adjustments within a setting that already makes reasonable adjustments.
Absolutely, Luke. Yeah. And fully recognise that there's not many establishments could do that. We had the space, we could do it.
Yeah.
But we were dealing with young people who'd been out of school 4 years, 7 years, part-time timetables, exclusions.
Yeah.
So.
And I know later on we're going to have a discussion about how, for example, a mainstream classroom supporting a young person with PDA could adopt some of what they're doing or influence their practice to support these young people a little bit later on. I've got a question for you before we get into the sort of bulk of it. What's the panda, Jilly?
Okay, so the panda is the ambassador for PDA, because pandas thrive with the right approach, as do PDA learners, and that the wrong approach is harmful to pandas, but it's also harmful and ineffective to our PDA people. So our ambassador is the panda. So yeah, that's our logo. We also talk later. Yeah, I'll talk about we've created a mnemonic around panda as well, a teaching mnemonic. So that's yeah.
Amazing. Thank you. I love that.
So I suppose we might as well ask the biggest question. What is PDA?
Yeah, it's a good starting point there, Jacob. Yes. So PDA stands for pathological demand avoidance. That's key. And it's widely but not universally understood to be a profile of autism. So it involves the avoidance of everyday demands and the use of social strategies as part of this avoidance. So autistic people with a PDA profile struggle with everyday demands, eating, drinking, getting dressed, just because they're demands. So this can include things they enjoy as well, so, playing their favorite game, because that becomes a demand. It's not a deliberate choice. It's a matter of can't, not won't at that moment. So, and those demands cause huge anxiety, which can trigger that distress behavior that we see. Maybe, they're kids who fight, or kids who flee, or even freeze response if those demands can't be avoided. So that pervasive demand avoidance is one sign to look out for, and it's pervasive. So it's all consuming, it's pathological, if you like. So that's quite key. And the other is the social strategies commonly used by PDA people to avoid these everyday demands. So that's the other key to note, to pick up on it. So this includes things, they're skilled at distracting us. They'll change the subject without us realizing. They might procrastinate. Yeah, I'll do it in a minute, soon. Yes, but that sort of soon never comes. They'll excuse themselves. They'll give amazing reasons why they can't do something. My knee hurts, I can't do PAD. My tummy hurts, I feel sick. Lots and lots of sort of social excuses, which again, you wouldn't see in other autism profiles. So that's the second thing that's really key. And also, it's not a key feature, but it's quite common. They withdraw into role play or fantasy to avoid those demands and to keep control over their lives. So I've worked with kids who have gone through periods of being a cat or a dog, a computer, a car, and they'll put the onus on, cats don't get dressed, dogs can't write, I'm a ghost today, you can't see me, sort of thing, really. So they'll use amazing excuses. So they're the most significant traits to look out for. But the other signs, because this is a spectrum, so there's other stuff going off, the other signs that they do appear incredibly sociable on the surface. So these are kids who can cope with conversational timings. They can cope, they've probably got good eye contact. But when you get to know them, there's no depth in that understanding. It's like a social veneer, if you like. They will also experience excessive mood swings and impulsivity. But this is because PDA is driven by anxiety. So they can go, troughs and then back down again all the time. And it's really difficult to understand where that's coming from sometimes. With our other autistic learners, you can work out why their anxiety is rising. Maybe you didn't get the schedule right, or the visual right, or there's some sensory issues, and you can usually find the trigger. It's not so easy with our PDA learners. And then the other part of the PDA profile is they are often very, very socially interested and focused on other people. So whereas a lot of our other autistic people have fascinations with objects and things, very often our PDA people focus intensely on one person. That could be negatively, it could be positively. If it's that positive aspect, it's really quite intense. They'll want to know everything about that person. They'll want to know what they're doing, when they're doing it. If they're in class, in teaching, and they've got a fascination with another teacher, they won't like the teacher talking to the other children. It's quite needs sensitive handling, sort of thing, really. So there's that difference there in terms of that restricted and repetitive patterns of behavior. The PDA learner, it's more about that focusing on other people. And as I say, and the role play often to an extreme extent. So our PDA adults talk about being in role to cope with the sort of neurotypical world, talk about being a role play a lot of the time, but using that as a controlling way and to manage demands, really, because if there's somebody else completing the demand, it's not them doing the demand. So it's their way they micromanage their lives, really. But also, I think it's also important. There are so many strengths that we need to be aware of. They've got a real strong sense of justice. They're usually really independent. They're charismatic. They're really creative. They've got the most fantastic sense of humor, and quite imaginative. So it's tapping into their strengths and those passions and those interests that's going to help you build up the trust and relationship, in terms of then helping build up that sort of relationship in education. So that's sort of basically.
I'm interested. That's fascinating, and that's taught me more about PDA than I knew already, just in the first sort of like 5-10 minutes of talking to you. So I appreciate that. And I've come across a lot of young people with PDA, but only tend to see an element of it, often the avoidance element. But the fact that they focus in on people makes a lot of sense now. And I've seen that, especially in mainstream settings where they might have a one-to-one member of staff who they are absolutely besotted by, and anybody else that works with that young person is just has no impact. Or they're besotted by a character. I remember a young person who was besotted by a wrestler that we used to work with, and the rest, everything he did in life was about this wrestler. I've got a question about, or do you know of, if there is any, is there any research, or do we know what the causes of PDA are? Or is it, for example, like autism, it's a neurodiversity, your brain is wired in a specific way from kind of near dot, and that's it? Is it on that line? Yeah?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah. So sort of, it is difficult at the moment because that's where we are with PDA in terms of research. But we would say a person is first assessed for autism, and then a PDA profile of autism may be considered if there's that marked demand avoidance. So that's why it's key to get the whole profile, because yes, marked demand avoidance is the most significant trait, but not the only trait. It's important that you get that whole picture to be able to think, I think something else going off here, really.
There's a couple of things that I'd love to ask you about. So just to kind of clarify that point you just made with Luke there, do I have to have an autism diagnosis before I get my PDA diagnosis, or, label?
Okay, so there is some controversy, because at the very beginning I said widely, but not universally understood to be a profile of autism. The diagnostic manuals, if you like, they set the criteria for autism. So it's not recognized, PDA is not recognized in those diagnostic manuals. But that's where we are at the moment. So it is a bit of a postcode lottery, but within the PDA Society, we say assessment for autism, and then a PDA profile may be considered. So it's really trying to focus on the needs, not so much on labels, not so much, focus on a needs-based support. So it is controversial, partly to do with research. There is some good research out there, but it's limited. PDA is still relatively young, and we need more research. But what we say, I suppose, to people is, move away from the medical model of the diagnostic manuals, look at the social model, there is research out there, there's lived experience out there. So pick up on that if you can, really. If they don't fit that what people see as the autism profile, just look that bit further. But I have to say, because there might be people listening who have a different viewpoint, which that's good to keep that communication. There are some people in the autistic community who say that this is a backward step, that we're moving away from those different terms, aren't we? We've moved on from Asperger, we've moved on from those functional labels. We're now using the term autistic. And there are some people who are worried that identifying a PDA profile is a bit of a setback. But for me, working with these children, for me, it's about getting the right support to get the right outcome, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Why? Just so that, again, I'm just not playing devil's advocate, but just so that I can get a full understanding, and maybe anybody listening or watching can. Why would that be considered a step backwards? What was the good thing about moving forward in this?
Because in terms of the autistic community, it would take, for example, Asperger's, very a common terminology. Everyone sort of understands or thinks they know, right, Asperger. So that person is academically perhaps very able, and can manage in lots of situations, holding down jobs, university, etc., etc. But because they all have real spiky profiles, that person can't get this, will be struggling with perhaps ordinary everyday demands such as cooking, how to get on a bus, and doesn't get the support because the profile is saying Asperger. Oh, right, okay, you're fine, you're okay. So, and saying somebody is severely autistic isn't right. So low functioning, yeah, they may need more support in self-care, but they're not necessarily low functioning in terms of other aspects of their lives. So, we're looking at support needs, really. So moving away from the whole labeling. So that's why there are some people who feel putting a subtype back into the autism world is taking that little step back. They would be arguing a different case. But
we have a colleague.
PDA Society, I'm
absolutely
going down that route.
Yeah,
because the needs, because I could see what we were doing in school with our other kids wasn't going to work for these kids. But I would also say, as we're understanding more and more about autistic learners, some of the approaches that we use for our PDA learners, I think, would be very beneficial for our whole autistic community as a whole. So I'm saying, hey, take a look at that.
There's a question that really nicely leads on to that, which is kind of next on our list. But as my brain doesn't kind of work in that way, I've got a couple of others that I want to squeeze in before that, if that's all right. One of the things that stuck out from something you said earlier was the social veneer, so like the mask almost. That was the word that came into my head. Is it always as obvious as I kind of know what your answer will be, but I'm interested to hear your thoughts on it. Is it as always kind of as blunt or as obvious as that, or can it be slightly more subtle? And what might that look like? And what can you do to spot some of those things? Does that make sense?
It does make sense, and I think it's one of the hardest things to identify. And I think even parents don't realise their youngsters are masking. So masking is like a social veneer. So it's and again, it's early research, but our PDA community and some of the PDA adults feel that for them, they've masked all their lives. And for them, it's a positive aspect because it means they've been able to fit in to the community that they're involved in, whether it's education or work or whatever. But for many, masking is holding in how they're feeling, hiding their emotions because they want to fit in. They don't want to feel different. And so they hold it in, and they hold it in perhaps in school because they want to be with their peers and they don't want to be seen to be different. But when they get home, it's like a Coke bottle. They explode at home. That emotion's got to come out somewhere, and it comes out at home because it's the safe place. They know their parents will love them forever, conditionally, sort of thing, really. So that's why we need to understand more about masking. There's a fantastic, I'll just signpost to the PDA Society, but we've got a great video clip from a young man called James who talks about masking and that it's really difficult to spot. So the key is understanding that it's a bit of a performance, and to listen to both the young person and to parents as to what masking looks like for them. I don't think in schools we can necessarily work with them on it. What we can do is provide the right environment so they don't have to mask so much, and to be aware of it. And then the masking may drop in right situations. But one of the girls I work with, she's got different masks for different people, depending on the situation she's in. So I think it's key to help them self-identify, to give them that self-awareness of what their profile looks like, what their triggers are. So if it is that demand avoidance, that's why they might be masking. And then if they can learn some self-regulation to accommodate that, that's going to help. It's a really, really tough one. The key is to collaborate with the family, find out if they mask, because also we've got two emotions. You've got the kids who externalize. So those kids who you just know they're in your classroom. you get the swearing, you get the throwing, you get all that sort of stuff, really. And we listen to that. We see those kids, and we need to, because they're disrupting case as well. But then we've got the internalized PDAers. These are the youngsters that we really need to be aware of. These are the youngsters who are the fawns, so they're people pleasers, who are internalizing everything they're feeling. So masking it internally and holding it in. And they're the youngsters who may then lead to sort of more mental health issues as they get older. So the key is to just collaborate with parents, be aware. Masking, they could be the class clown, but they could be internalizing as well.
You mentioned anxiety as well, which I found quite interesting, because I suppose it links to one of the things you just said there. It can take lots of different shapes and forms, and I suppose ultimately what you're talking about quite a bit here is understanding the need and knowing the pupil well enough to be able to recognize some of these things and start to make links, not necessarily diagnose, that's not where I'm getting to, but just to recognize that could be something that's supporting that need for that mask. But yes. It's really interesting that the links that I'm making in my head anyway to some of the things that I've seen and that I've worked with. There's a question that I was going to ask, but Luke seems to think that we might have touched on it. I am going to ask you it just because we talked a little bit about why some people might consider it a step back to have it PDA recognised. Well, I just kind of, if we've already answered it, feel free to say that we have. But I'd be really interested to know why it is so important that PDA is recognised.
Yeah, so it's important because there's a difference between autistic people with extreme demand avoidance, autistic people with demand avoidance, and pathological demand avoidance. So that's the key, really. So it's the key is understanding the way they experience demand avoidance. It's all pervasive. It's around demands. It's not around the task. They can cope with the task, but it's the way it's presented that's the problem, basically. And that social aspect, so for example, we are, a child is asked to complete a task at school. To avoid it, they might say that, it's boring. I did that in year 5. Really quite social techniques, which we wouldn't see perhaps with some of our other autistic learners. Or they might say they might break their pens. They might make an excuse. All those bits I mentioned earlier. Then if we don't address that, we've got what we call a hierarchy of avoidance. So it starts off that they're okay, that they appear calm and able, but then they'll use those distraction excuses, procrastinating. If we're still pushing the demand with our PDA learners, they'll go to the next level, that fantasy. They may drop to the floor saying their legs don't work. They may go into that masking, that complete compliance, like just hiding under the radar so nobody gets them. If we're still pushing the demand and not rephrasing it, then we've got the flight, freeze, and they're in a panic attack, and that crisis thing. But the key difference, why it's so important, is that, as I found out, those conventional approaches to supporting our autistic learners, that consistency, that structure, clarity, visual schedules are not going to work for your PDA learners. And it will actually exacerbate and escalate demand avoidant behaviors. So does that answer that? I don't know if I
no, that's really useful. Thank you for
that. Is there a particular? I'm curious to know. Is there for teachers and support staff in a mainstream school, for example, is there a particular age or particular time where these behaviours become more kind of apparent? Is it going to be really obvious in nursery, for example, or is it more sort of like when they become a teenager? What's the deal with that?
Yeah, so I'd say really, parents always know, right? But there isn't. They learn to micromanage their day. They learn to sort of walk on eggshells, if you like, because they work out what's going wrong. And they go to nursery, and again, because they are often quite social, they'll play. But what you start to see, but people don't pick up on, is that a typical little play scenario, if they were really observant, they'll probably see that child controlling the play. So they're the teacher of the little group. They're the chef, not the sous chef. They'll put the chairs out and tell people where to sit. They'll get the Lego out as to what they want to play. But they're playing with that little group. And so early years, it's a nurturing environment. It's about experiencing. It's about, less structure. As they get older, from year 2, when the pressure's put on them to sit at their desks, to be able to do certain things, that's when other people might see the demand avoidance coming in. And then again, because the degree of, somebody needs will vary. PDA is a spectrum. So, it will just depend how the PDA manifests itself in each child as to when that young person starts struggling. So I think parents would know. I mean, parents talk about, they realized it was their first child, for example, they realized they always struggled to get the child into the car seat because the demand of putting the straps on. There was always 2 of them changing the nappy because the kid didn't want, the nappy to go on as a demand. But because we haven't caught up professionally understanding the profile, we just sort of chug along until education kicks in and it's the pressure. So at year 2 onwards, you start to see those early signs, but still not necessarily picked up.
I've kind of got a devil's advocate bit for you, and it might be a little bit early for a devil's advocate, but I feel like Simon's right. So I would say that, for example, my daughter, she's 3. She sometimes struggles to follow an instruction or to sit in the car seat, and we have to put and even a change of a nappy. My son's going through it at the minute. He's 10-month-old. So how do you determine the difference between behaviours that are PDA and behaviours that are developmental delay, or behaviours that are due to an SEMH need, for example, due to an adverse background or not having good enough care as a youngster? So again, the developmental delay.
Yeah, I think because it's holistic, I think what's useful to do is, if you're thinking things, is to keeping a diary of where they do that avoidance and see if it's all pervasive. So it's not just because, there'll be other stuff going off there in terms of I'm a child, that sort of thing. Anyway, there may be sensory stuff going off there. So it's a sensory thing. There may be other, learning differences going off there. So it's really about being a detective and seeing, do your little ones hate brushing their teeth? Do your little ones demand that you get them dressed when they're capable of getting dressed? Do your, it's looking at the whole day, keeping a diary of, okay, and then looking at those key features I mentioned earlier and seeing if there's anything else parents talk about. It's a bit of a cliche, that light bulb moment. Once they hear about PDA and they're looking for what to look for their young person, it ticks all the boxes. So it's.
Thanks for that. I think you answered that well.
Yeah.
I like the phrase you use about being a detective. We often use the phrase when we're supporting young people with their behaviour. We translate behaviour, and that's something that we try to do quite a lot, is translate what the young person's saying to us so we can find an appropriate strategy to meet need. But I like the phrase being a detective as well. And you said, right, parents know the kids, don't they?
Absolutely. And then, if for instance, it was about the car seat, for example, but that was just one of many things, then parents learn to reduce the demand of that. They'll use the same techniques the kids use. They'll distract, they'll talk about their special interests, so it's not the demand to put the seat on. That's sort of hidden, if you like, in fact, of them sort of going out to the car. If you have to, then again, because and depending on the age of the child, it really is the law. So I'm really sorry, I can't move because the law says. You don't blame yourself, or you don't say, come on, you've got to put this seatbelt on, or you've got to put your car seat on. You blame somebody else.
So supporting PDA is very different than to just supporting. So I'll go back to my daughter in the car seat, because it just kind of makes sense in my head, because it's something that we're doing at the minute. Is if we want to create resilience in someone, the theory is, the science is, that we produce predictable, moderate, and controlled levels of stress. We don't take the stress away. So for somebody with PDA, that just wouldn't be a thing. They just wouldn't be able to cope with that. That'd be completely the opposite to what you're doing for teaching resilience for pretty much everybody else.
Yeah, 100%. You've just got it, really. And parents go down that traditional parenting route, because they've got this kid and they think, well, gosh, what's going on here? Right, more discipline, naughty corner, nanny stuff sort of going off. But it just makes things worse, and it doesn't work. So it's understanding the why of the behavior and not the what of the behavior, if that makes sense, and saying, okay, this is the underlying issues. How can we reduce those? Which may be rephrasing things. It may be using some other approaches that we sort of probably talk about. So, and parents eventually learn to do that, or drop all the demands, because if it's important for that little one to get that car seat because you're going to work and they've got to go to play school or whatever, that's the priority. So what we know is PDA is driven by the need to feel in control, high anxiety if that doesn't happen. And the more demands, the more their worry bucket flows and over tips. So parents learn, this is important to go to, this is priority. So actually, we're not going to wash our faces today. We're not going to clean our teeth. We're going to have a bar snack, a cereal bar in the car. So that's reduced lots of demands, because the priority was to get into that car seat without the fight and a kid being distressed, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Completely changing the mindset, really. You turn your parenting skills upside down. They will build their own resilience. They are incredibly resilient. They're coping in a very, very tough world, and they'll find their way as long as they've got the support to do that.
It's a good question. I was thinking of something similar, Luke. How do you differentiate between sort of typical developmental behaviour? And you've answered that brilliantly there. Thank you.
Yeah, so we know a tantrum, but a crisis to manage, that panic attack, there's two very different things. Tantrums you can work out. If there was an incentive for a tantrum, they would buy into it, wouldn't they?
Yeah, no, it makes a lot of sense. Do you think COVID had what sort of effects do you think that had on young people or adults?
Well, I can only go from my experience. I don't know the wider world. It seems to have been mixed. So in the school that I closely involved with, the PDA kids, I don't know if I can say this on, you might have to take this bit out. The PDA children learnt more during COVID times than they did with us, because they were in their safe environment, even though we've got incredibly safe, and they love coming into school. These kids never had days off. Even when they're ill, they were in school. They loved coming into school. But taking away a lot of the demands, the transitional demands of socializing, they were able to have the flexibility to do the lessons when we sent them through online. So for some, it was great. For others, we haven't got them back in yet.
Yeah, because you even in a world where you're making those reasonable adjustments in a space that's making reasonable adjustments, there is still some demand. You're in the building. We have to walk around the building.
You have to walk through the door. Yeah. Somebody might say, "Open the door for me." Somebody might say hello to you.
Yeah.
So, you learn. Actually, I learned never to talk to the children before they spoke to me, because I might get abuse. If I didn't notice that their body language, that they've got their hood up, that their head down, and I said, "Oh, morning," then they swear at me or kick me as I go by, then I've got to try and deal with that. I think it's better to wait for them to sort of get that feeling of how they're feeling before you sort of move on, because we don't know how many demands that they cope with. And I say going off tangent because that's what I do. But anyway, a lot of our PDA kids roll out of bed and get in the taxi, because even though they really want to come to school, parents know that any demands placed on them, whether it's those ordinary everyday demands for eating, getting dressed, are going to cause problems. And we can deal with that in school. They can go to deal with their breakfast. If they want a shower, they can have a shower, etc. But so they, these are kids who have got quite that complex PDA. So, but lots of parents, again, the same, that's what happens. You reduce as many unnecessary demands to pick your priority. So it depends what the priority for that moment is.
I know we have started to touch on some things like the one that you've just said there about removing demands, etc., as a strategy. But I suppose we're quite interested to hear about practical strategies that you've maybe had experience of using in school or outside of school, or things to completely avoid. And if there's any sort of examples or stories that fit alongside that, that'd be really interesting to hear.
Okay. So I'm going to bring the panda in now, if that's okay, because that's how we sort of base a lot of our work on. I think the first thing, I suppose, is we have to recognise that PDA is extremely complex. No question, it's tough for teachers to meet needs. But the degree of support one person may need will vary depending on how that PDA manifests itself. So we always have to take that, into account. So it can be to a greater or a lesser extent, but it can also vary at different times and at different stages in their lives. But the key thing is to understand that what you're seeing, the approach we need to use is keeping anxiety to a minimum, giving them a feeling of a sense of control. They're good sort of starting points, really. So it's about collaborating with them, even at a young age. It's about careful use of language, which I'll come on to, and balancing demands. And it's working with them and not against them. So it is a different, in terms of teaching, it's quite a different type of relationship, because they don't have a hierarchy. They see themselves as equal to us. So the key is having that feeling that they've got that reciprocity and that autonomy to be listened to, and that they are equal to us. So as I mentioned earlier, we use a panda as our ambassador. Because of that, they need the right environment with specific approaches tailored to their needs, and same for our PDA learners. So on our website, we've got a mnemonic, which is a simple reminder of helpful approaches. So the overall message is about seeing that young person, explore their interests genuinely. So whatever their interest is in, whether it's Peppa the Pig, whether it's Call of Duties, Dungeons and Dragons, do your homework, learn as much as you can about that so you can get that connection, and engage with them positively. So if I can break the panda down into the P, so if that makes sense. So the P is about picking battles all the way through. So it's about prioritizing. So it may be about minimizing rules. They're anxious. They've got their blouse tucked out of their trousers. Is it the moment to say, tuck your blouse into your skirt or whatever? Is there flexibility around uniforms? Is there flexibility around transitions? Do they have to go certain time to certain places? Can you have that flexibility? Routine. So take a typical primary class. The routine of coming in from playground into classroom is lining up, coming into the classroom, perhaps putting their bag up, taking their coats off. How many demands are there within that one routine of that transition? So what can be reduced? So can the child choose where to line up? Can somebody else hang his coat up or bag up? Unless he wants to. Does he have to sit where he's expected to sit? Can he choose? Can he go to his safe place, his beanbag in the corner? Can he sit at his workstation? And then again, because transitions are tough because of the fear of unknown and that fear of uncertainty, can he have a motivating activity to settle him down, ready to learn? Chances are, because I think these kids can multitask really well, if he can have his sensory fidget tools, if he can have something that he's motivated in, whether it's doodling, drawing, whether it's playing with a piece of Lego, that might be enough to self-regulate him to be able to access the lesson. So the P is about picking battles. It's about explaining reasons. They can follow rules if there's a purpose for the rule and not just because we told them so. So make sure they know why something can or can't happen. And then the A is all around anxiety management. We talk very much about the low arousal approach, which is actually an empathetic approach which focuses on reducing triggers. It's focusing as us being part of that trigger, and that we're not just passive observers, and looking at how we can support that, the challenges that the kids face. So that's very much around that non-confrontational approach. It's about keeping calm. It's about treating those distress behaviors at top of the triangle, as mentioned, as panic attacks. There's not a choice there. They can't. It's a crisis to manage. It's not them trying to move, get their own way or whatever. And then the N is all about negotiation, collaboration. It's about, I think, facilitating their learning. Does that make sense? Rather than having that hierarchical approach can work really well. But keeping fairness and trust central. So hear what they're saying. And then the biggest one is about disguising and managing demands. So it's about learning to phrase demands indirectly. So it's not just direct demands that the PDA people struggle with. So the direct demands, you need to do this, come and sit down. There's indirect demands and internal demands. Praise is a demand. Eating when they feel they're hungry is a demand. There's demands within demands. So the demands of sitting still in assembly is a little demand that might stop the big demand. And then they ought to demands of life, like of brushing teeth. So using what we call declarative language, like a commentary, works really well. So rather than you need to, starting with a conversation, I wonder what we need for this lesson. I reckon this would be good. So using declarative language is absolutely key. It's less threatening and it avoids that very direct demand. You need to, you must, it's time to.
Yeah.
So
thank you for those strategies, and I think they're great, and I think people listening to them will really want to take them on board. My key word there in my sentence is want to take them on board. I guess my question to you is, I don't know if it's a should they or can they. So should they, I'm talking about PDA learners, or can they, PDA learners, be in a mainstream school or be in an SEMH school successfully? I know you said you work in an AS, you work for the NAS, and you're in a school that's specific for children with autism, and you've still had to make a separate provision within your setting to support PDA learners. So my question is, should they, PDA learners, or can they be in a mainstream setting or an SEMH setting, or would they have to significantly change their practice? I mean, they can supplement it with what you've said, absolutely, but I understand that that can be difficult for the rest of the cohort of kids in there, as PDA is quite a small profile. Should they or can they basically be in those settings?
Both of those, really, because these kids want to learn. They just can't learn under the conditions that we put them under. So it's really coming, there's so many questions there. It's really coming from involving the whole school. Is the whole school having that ethos of inclusivity, basically, understanding about neurodivergent students and making the whole school aware of that. So there is that. We have, as I said in the beginning, PDA is very complex, it's tough, and there are some kids, like the kids I work with, they came from a mainstream setting, but 70% of our leavers went back into mainstream college and onto university. So there's that element. The younger people can understand their profile, help them with those strategies to understand and micromanage their day, and people to realize, by just reducing some of those unnecessary demands, will keep them in a mainstream setting. The mainstream setting or SEN school having the flexibility in some areas, not big areas, but in some areas, and then reducing some of the demands. They will need more downtime.
Yeah.
So then, to me, it's about equity. It's about the resources. It's not about equality.
And this is not, I guess this isn't something schools are not used to doing anyway. We are making, so they have to make reasonable adjustments by law for their learners in mainstream schools. And SEMH schools and special schools do that. That's what they're built on. So this is just a different type of reasonable adjustment for a different profile of kid. I'm going to pass over to Jacob just to, but thank you very much for that. That was.
I mean, we recognise that it's tough and some can't, and we can get that. But if they can, and just an example, if you're working in an autism specific school, all your other learners need the now and next up on their timetables. They need their now and next schedules. And you've got a PDA child in that class. What are you going to do? Well, all you do actually is say to the PDA child that whiteboard with all the nows and next and structuring is for you as a teacher, because you've got a rubbish memory. But here's yours. And that's where the element of choice comes in. That's where you can give them that. And it doesn't take too much, and it might be just something on the whiteboard. For your other learners, it might say 15 minutes reading, 5 minutes drawing, 5 minutes feedback. That's what they want. But for your PDA learners, you'd give them, your choices today are 15 minutes reading, 10 minutes drawing, or your project work. So the flexibility is there. The control is there because they can decide in what order. You may put, do you want to use the red or the blue crayon? The choice is theirs. They've got the control. Whereas your other learners, you would just probably give them the blue pen because they needed that structure. So, we differentiate work all the time, but we can differentiate our language, but it's hard.
Yeah, of course.
We're used to standing up there and delivering.
Yeah.
And this is what we're doing. And you can't do that.
But you
can take PDA aside.
Yeah, I appreciate that example. I think you delivered that really well there. So thank you.
I suppose one of the last questions that I'd ask is there a specific thing other than that experience you had of, having those pupils in that setting and sort of starting to develop a specialist space and offer for them, even in a specialist setting? Was there anything that you came across, research, reading, training, that you'd really recommend people look at? Other than the obvious, I mean, I'm sure you'll mention in here, obviously, the PDA Society, because there's some wonderful resources and clips and information on there. But was there anything that, I'm not asking for a defining moment, because I think we've probably got that one in the sense of that practical example. But was there any other sort of research or training or books, anything like that just springs to mind that people would be, good to look at to gain a bit more understanding?
The first book I came across, and I don't know if you've come across his work, is Ross Green's work. So Ross Greene wrote his first book was called The Explosive Child, and it wasn't specifically about PDA, but it was working. He's called it collaborative and proactive solutions to crisis management, if you like, in teaching. So that was the first book I went to when I got my sort of first kid. But I mean, I suppose what I'm going to say is, PDA Society, we have got so much resources. We've got a book list there, which we review and recommend. And I think I'd just send people there to
it really is good. You know, there's lots of resources on there for people, videos, articles, strategies, advice for learners, for adults, for absolutely all events. It really is a useful place to go if people are interested. And is that the best place for people to get in touch with you as well, or to get in touch with, you know, for wanting that kind of help specifically around PDA?
Yeah. So basically, just plug the PDA Society. It was set up in 1997 as parents of PDA children. It was called the Contact Group then, and then it changed its name to the PDA Society, I think, in 2016. So yeah, what we do, we offer information support training for PDA people, for their families, and for professionals. What we're trying to do is just increase acceptance and understanding of the profile to improve outcomes for everybody, really. So it's just run by a small group of us. We're all volunteers. Everybody else, apart from myself, have a direct connection to PDA. So we've got an inquiry line. We've got an online forum. We offer loads and loads of training courses right across from sort of primary schools, mainstream schools, education other than at the school, alternative provision sessions. So yeah, www.pdasociety.org.uk. If you can plug that would be fantastic. And honestly, that's where where the books would go to. So yeah.
Brilliant. I don't know whether you've got anything to add to that, but I've absolutely, it's fascinating. It's been really insightful to get a kind of first-hand experience of what that looks like. You know, things to look out for, or that you can support children, young people with, specifically around PDA.
Yeah. Thanks, Jilly, for coming on and giving us your time and sharing your message. And the whole point of a conversation with is we want to promote people that are doing things in a slightly different way, that are relational based. And PDA is not something that I've definitely worked with children with PDA, and I'm still supporting schools that have children with PDA, but it's not something that I would profess myself to be an expert in. So just even getting a few of those tips from you has made me think a little bit different about some of the ways in which I'll work with children with PDA in the future. And yeah, so I just massively thanks for your time and appreciate it.
Okay. Yeah, no, it's been good. Thank you.
So that's the end of that one. If you're interested, obviously head over to the PDA Society. You can get some more information. Please feel free to kind of get in touch with us around any comments or any more information as well. We've got @Positive Regard on Twitter, and obviously there's the Positive Regard website where you can get in touch with us for any more information as well. So thanks for tuning in.